With me now, the TUC General Secretary, Francis O'Grady. Welcome back to the programme. You don't like what they're planning, but I mean, it was in the manifesto and they got an overall majority. So I guess it's going to happen.
Well, we're going to try and stop it happening because I think there are people across the political party spectrum who are worried about this unfair and unnecessary attack on working people's rights and civil liberties.
What's unfair about saying, particularly in public sector strikes, which cause massive inconvenience, that at least 50% of people should actually turn out to vote?
Well, it's the wrong answer. It's wrong to count abstentions as no votes. And we've got a much better solution, in fact, that we were working on for over a year with Vince Cable, the previous business secretary, and employers, which is safe and secure balloting. But I think the other problem is nobody believes that this is really about improving democratic participation, because if that was the case, the government wouldn't be asking us to jump all these hurdles and say to employers, if they do jump those hurdles, you can bus in agency workers to break that strike.
But if you're going to bring the city to a halt, as this city came to a halt last week with the tube strike, or you're going to close a hospital down and make life very inconvenient for patients and their relatives, surely at the very least you've got to get 50% of the people to turn out for that.
Well, of course, on those London Underground ballots, they did beat those thresholds. So, but I think
isn't that a decent thing to ask?
Worried.
What's wrong with a 50% threshold?
We always want to get a majority and we want to improve participation. That's why we've been arguing for safe and secure electronic balloting. But I think the government needs to come clean on this. If it was simply the thresholds, that's one thing, but it isn't, is it? They're encouraging employers to break democratic strikes by bussing in agency workers, totally unfair on those agency workers, by the way, and potentially criminalising people stood on peaceful picket lines. Midwives, nurses, firefighters finding themselves arrested by, frankly, police officers who many of us think have better things to do, catching criminals rather than arresting decent working men and women.
But unions today and strikes today are overwhelmingly a public sector phenomenon. You've got almost no workers in the private sector. I think it's only less than 15% of private sector workers are unionised, and there are very, very few private sector strikes. It's overwhelmingly a public sector phenomenon, and that is what, it's the people who pay for these services out of their taxes. So isn't it, and they cause the most disruption to other people's lives. So isn't it logical that there should be the toughest rules on whether in the end these strikes take place in the public sector?
Strikes are always a last resort, but I think you'll find there's very strong public support for what is seen as a very basic British civil liberty, and that is the right to withdraw your labour.
But that's not being taken. But that's not being taken away, is it?
The last big strike ballot was, of course, the steel workers protecting their pensions. Now, if they hadn't run that ballot, the employer was saying no young people joining the steel industry can join the pension scheme. When they ran the ballot, the employer changed his mind and they didn't need to go on strike, which is what happens with most ballots.
So what's wrong with that?
The lesson is that unless you've got power on both sides of the bargaining table, you won't get a fair settlement. And I'm afraid that the government is loading the dice against the very blue-collar workers it says it wants to champion.
What do you say to that, Stephen Crabb?
Well, I just don't agree. I mean,
no, I got that bit. But why?
The costs that these strikes in public services impose on the rest of the economy, the rest of the society, are huge. They're greater than they ever are. When you bring public services to a standstill, the knock-on costs for the rest of society are enormous. And I think a lot of people would be surprised that there aren't these kind of thresholds in place anyway. And I think anybody outside of the world of trade unions or the world of party politics that we're in, looking at it, would say that this is a reasonable set of measures that will actually enhance the legitimacy of strike action.
But don't you need to make up your mind whether this is about improving democratic participation, in which case let us have safe and secure online balloting, or whether it's about stopping strikes altogether? Because if it's the latter, then it seems to us that's the direction you're taking. And most people feel very strongly, none of us, certainly the workers themselves don't want to be on strike. They lose a day's pay.
It's not about stopping strike action altogether. Nick Bowles, the Minister, made the point that a lot of the recent strike action that we've seen actually would have passed the threshold.
Well, he made the point that the majority do, absolutely.
But when a strike in critical public services takes place, people can't get their kids to school, they can't get to their doctor's appointments, I think the public want assurance that the strike action is actually rooted in a proper democratic
do
mandate.
you think it will help industrial relations to have agency workers bust in to bust strike?
Well, that's a very good question, because if the workers vote, if there's a big turnout and they easily pass the 50% threshold and they go on strike because they feel they have a real grievance, like the steel workers that Francis O'Grady mentioned, and it seems a decent cause, and it's legal and lawful, and they're exercising the democratic rights, and they've conformed to all union legislation, why would you then allow the employer to bus in agency workers? That's basically strike breaking.
So everything you describe is exactly right, and nobody wants to stop that. And there will only be very limited circumstances where agency workers would be appropriate.
How do you know that?
There are certain services where the people on strike have a certain amount of training, where you simply cannot bus in.
But why would you allow that?
Because there are certain services that you want to keep running for the benefit of the rest of
But
society and the economy.
You know, when the midwives were on strike, we have long-standing, decent agreements to make sure that no mother, no pregnant woman would be harmed, and that's true across public services. Why would you do something so provocative to those midwives who, after all, were simply on strike for a 1% pay increase, and you would bus in untrained workers to substitute for them?
Come on, there's no way that untrained workers will be filling in for midwives in
So
hospitals.
why do something so provocative?
So we are talking about a limited set of circumstances where agency workers may be appropriated to keep critical services running. And I think that the public expects the framework for union regulation to evolve as the economy changes. We haven't had any change in union legislation for more than a quarter of a century.
We have far fewer strikes today than we did during the 1980s.
But the costs that they impose on the rest of the society are getting greater.
Let me bring
Democracy,
in Shabana Mahmood.
Never mind.
Does Labour have a policy on this yet?
We're against the action that the government is taking, and I think that this.
You're against You're against every bit of it, or just some of it?
No, we're against what the government is saying, and we think that this is the wrong approach that they're taking. The threshold
turnout?
issue. Yes.
You're against that?
Yes, we.
So you wouldn't mind when we had a strike in the NHS a couple of years ago that it closed a particular hospital, even though only 10% of the Unison members had voted for it?
Look,
are you in favour of that?
I think that disruption does have a big impact. That is true. But in the end, if you're going to have a discussion about thresholds and democratic legitimacy, as Stephen has just engaged in his exchange with Francis, then you've got to answer a bigger question about democracy and participation and legitimacy.
Sure.
So in the West Midlands, for example, we have a police and crime commissioner elected on a 10.4% turnout in the West Midlands. And you'd never hear Theresa May saying that was an illegitimate election.
It's kind of apples and pears, though, isn't it? Just get it right. Your party's policy is that even if only 10% of the relevant workforce have voted for a strike, that's all. The strike can go ahead.
I think that imposing an arbitrary threshold is wrong.
Well, it's not arbitrary. It's 50%.
Well, I think that we could have even higher thresholds. We could say that it should have a two-thirds majority, for example. If you're going to get into a debate about thresholds, then I think you need a more consistent approach across the whole of public life, including in politics, including in elections that take place for the House of Commons. We don't have those debates about legitimacy when it comes to our elections, and we're trying to impose something on public sector workers, which I think actually, and everything that Stephen has just said, shows a Conservative Party wanting to relive its greatest hits from the 80s rather than deal with genuinely helping workers in the workplace.
These greatest hits, none of which in 13 years your party rolled back in power.
Well, look,
correct?
We've got to...
Correct?
No, we didn't roll those back, but we have a strong set of
popular.
laws already in place when it comes to strike action. I don't see the reason to mess about with them now. I think it's ideological.
So you've got the Labour Party on side.
Not just the Labour Party. I think there are a number of backbench Conservative MPs who are very worried about the civil liberties aspects of this. Wait and see.
We will. You have to tell us first.
We have to see the bill published first.
You have to tell us first. Francis O'Grady, thank you for that.